Hello, everyone. This has been a long time coming. It's the first individual album review on this channel of 2025, and it's one that I've been planning on posting for a while now, but I just never really got around to it because of some technical difficulties and just a busy schedule outside of this with work and school and other stuff. So, I'm finally reviewing this new Ethel Cain album called Perverts. It's one of the most anticipated albums of 2025 for a lot of people, and it's probably the first really big release of 2025 in the music critic world. Yes, there was that Bad Bunny album that came out before it, but I feel like in the music critic world, this was probably more anticipated. And especially considering how much critical acclaim her 2022 debut Preacher's Daughter received, I could already tell that this was going to be getting a ton of attention. In fact, she's one of those artists who is so famous in the music critic world that she's already started to build a lot of traction in pop culture without even making it onto mainstream radio or even having a particularly accessible sound. And this is where we get into the conversation about Preacher's Daughter, which I've been low-key dreading. So the first thing that I want to mention is that I obviously don't know whether or not the story on that album is based on personal experiences. I mean, obviously at least some of it is fictional, and if you've heard the album, you know why. But even though Ethel Cain is a character, and Hayden Anadonia, the artist behind this project, has described that album as being more about a fear that she has of what could go wrong, look, regardless of how much or how little of the story is personal, it's clearly a really serious album which has a lot of heavy subject matter, and at the very least, it definitely seems like something that Hayden just had to get out in order to process those fears and potentially traumas. And it's why I personally feel really bad for saying that I personally think Preacher's Daughter is a really bad album. Look, my early reviews from my blog have not aged well, including the short review that I gave of that album, and I honestly wish I'd done a full-length review of it just because of how much there is packed into that album experience. But I will say that while I do wish I'd gone more in depth on it, I stand by my 4 out of 10 rating that I gave it. And yeah, obviously when I call this album bad, it's totally subjective, but I genuinely just have a hard time understanding why so many critics decided it was the best thing ever. And even more baffling to me was the reception of the big standout single American Teenager, which won over pretty much everybody except me, with so many critics calling it a pop masterpiece, whereas I just think it sounds like an extremely mediocre cross between Dreams by the Cranberries and Don't Stop Believin' by Journey, the latter of which is interpolated in a really weird way that I don't think works at all. And in my opinion, that's still probably one of the better songs on that album, because the rest of it is so tedious, and it's mostly because of the production, where there's no firepower, way too many moments where everything just clashes together super awkwardly and sounds god-awful, and so much fucking reverb. If there's anything I'll give that album credit for, it's the clear amount of effort that went into the writing, where she clearly had high ambitions and thought out the concept quite well, even though I don't think the individual tracks are remotely good. And I mean, it's not like I was ever wowed by Hayden as a singer, and it's not like the melodies were all that interesting. And look, I know I'm being really harsh, and if I had a large audience, I'd be getting a ton of hate for this right now. But as always, it's all just my opinion. And even though I don't totally get the appeal, I am glad she has such a passionate fan base. She clearly deserves it, especially considering everything that she went through to get to where she is now. I've heard a bit about her story, and it's quite interesting. So if you're wondering why I'm being so harsh, well, I wanted to give some context for why my expectations were so low for this new record of hers. And don't get me wrong, I'd love to be proven wrong here. But just considering how little there was on that last album that even remotely interested me, and a lot more that actively annoyed me while I was listening to it, well, yeah, I can't say my expectations were high for this one. But I wanted to give it a fair shot, so how is Perverts by Ethel Cain? Well, this is certainly not what I was expecting. And unfortunately, the one thing I was right about is that I don't like this album. But what surprised me was just how different it is from her debut. Because while Preacher's Daughter featured a mix of Americana, country, pop, alternative rock, dream pop, shoegaze, and much more, Perverts is a lot closer to an ambient drone album. And in points, that's literally what it is. And don't get me wrong, the reasons why I couldn't get into this album do share some in common with Preacher's Daughter, and I'll get to that in a bit. But there are some moments on this album you could have played for me, and I probably would have never guessed that this was Ethel Cain, even though she has dipped her toes in this sort of sound before, most notably on Ptolemaea, which is basically interpolated or maybe even sampled on Housofpsychoticwomn on this album. But it's not like I wouldn't believe it if you told me, and I think it's because the sound of her music just doesn't really feel like it has a strong identity. And yeah, I know that me saying that could very well dampen my reputation as a music critic, but note that I specifically mentioned the sound, because I think what makes her more of a unique artist is the character that she portrays and the story arc that she sings about. Or if I just heard a brief snippet of her music, I may think it could be any of a large number of artists. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're more of an album artist, like Ethel Cain seems to be to her fans. And while we're on that note, I should probably mention that this is technically being released as an EP. Now, in the past, I have made a rule for myself where I only review full length studio albums, or at least I only call it an album review if it's a full length studio album. And typically, I don't review EPs because I don't usually consider them eligible for, or I've never considered them eligible for my year end lists. I think I'm going to change that this year. I think it's time for me to change that. I already reviewed a mixtape earlier this year that was technically not a studio album. I've unintentionally reviewed EPs that I thought were technically albums, but they weren't in the past. Even last year, I remember that happening. I think there was one the year before as well. And there may be even more that I just never became aware of. And especially when I saw that this album was being considered an EP, I just decided, fuck it, I don't care. It's an album. To me, it's an album. I don't know what makes it an EP. It's 9 tracks. It's 90 minutes long. I do not understand why this is being considered an EP. But the point is, I'm changing that rule. I'm reviewing it as an album. I mean, it's not going to be on my favorite albums of the year, obviously. You can probably tell by the things that I've said. But if I liked it enough, it would be eligible because, again, it's long enough. It's way longer than most regular studio albums. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. But anyway, getting into the actual music on this album, it opens with the title track, which is a 12-minute ambient track that, in my opinion, really doesn't do anything all that interesting. And immediately I'm already wondering what I'm getting out of this other than content to post on my YouTube channel. And it's also the first mention of something which a lot of this album is about: masturbation. And yeah, it's an interesting idea making an entire album about masturbation. Not saying no one's ever done this before, but I'm not sure if I've ever heard it, at least knowingly. But this track just feels like a bad attempt at convincing you that it's the most groundbreaking, thought-provoking thing ever. When really to me it just seems like a really corny way of sarcastically going, oh no, lots of people are masturbating and you never would have expected that from them. Everyone is sinning. And I think what bugs me the most is the attempt at making this sound dramatic. Whereas to me it just sounds like the kind of irony where the artist thinks it's a lot more revolutionary than it actually is. If I'm overcomplicating this with my word choices, I'll simplify it by saying that I understand this is not an anti-masturbation track, nor does it sound like one, but rather sarcastically criticizing masturbation as a way of criticizing those who actually think masturbation is some horrible sin. And I think that message is pretty clear, but the way it's presented just makes it sound like you're supposed to go, oh wow, what a revolutionary criticism. And really, I just don't think there's much to it at all. Now, the album takes a turn for the next track, Punish, which is probably the most accessible track on the album, and probably the closest to anything that would have been on Preacher's Daughter, although that means it suffers from most of the same issues that album did for me, and that the lack of energy makes for a really dreary listen when there's so much reverb that leaves the vocals having absolutely no impact. And it's not like Hayden is a bad singer or anything, it's just that the reverb and the specific way the vocals are produced don't work at all with this production, where I wish the natural vocals here actually stood out in the mix, and that especially goes for the final leg of the track where she's completely drowned out by that distorted guitar, which is a really odd fit for such an atmospheric and dreamy song. Once again, probably the closest thing to Preacher's Daughter on this album, although again, it's worth noting once again that the aforementioned Housofpsychoticwomn, the third track on this album, is almost certainly in some way related to the track Ptolemaea from Preacher's Daughter. And I'm sorry, but I think this is a terrible track. And let's be honest, if this was not by one of the most critically acclaimed artists of the past few years, most people wouldn't give a shit about this and would instead agree that it's basically just torture, where it just repeats, I love you, over and over and over again with these weird repetitive noises that just sound like a carpet cleaner or a washing machine or something like that. And yeah, I get that Ptolemaea is literally a song about abuse from the perspective of the victim, and my personal critique of that track is that I just didn't think it was nearly as terrifying as it was intended to be, and just kind of felt like it was kind of there. But this is just too much. And while I can absolutely get behind the idea of harsh, distorted sounds in music, in fact, I often really love music that pushes boundaries of being musical, I'm all for experimentation in art, but this is just too much. I'm sorry. I can't call this in any way good. At least it's certainly not for me. And the same thing goes for the next track, which is a lot more like what I was expecting to hear from Ethel Cain, and by that I mean it's some of the most dull, lifeless slowcore that doesn't have anything to make it emotionally resonate with me, and I don't even find the vocals impressive. It reminds me a lot of Billie Eilish in the very whispery vocal delivery, and coming from me, that's not a good thing. And the percussion sounds overly stiff here too. And just like so many songs on Preacher's Daughter, I think this track suffers from way too much reverb, at least in the end of the song. In fact, maybe it's not just the amount of reverb, but the way it's applied. And a song like this is supposed to be about emphasizing the haunting vocal delivery and making it really in your face, which is what I think a lot of this album is trying to do, but the reverb makes it feel a lot more distant. And in the case of this song, I don't even think the more in your face moments of the vocal production work because of the vocal delivery, which I already mentioned. And look, the idea of the lyrics could have worked, describing a love which is actually way more toxic than it appears on the surface, and the narrator realizes that they need to stay away from each other, as painful as it is. But it doesn't really go beyond that, and the lack of detail just leaves me feeling very unimpressed. And that would be fine if this track had anything to offer musically, but it's such a slog to get through for the reasons I already mentioned. Now from this point on is where I think the album starts to sound a lot less like I was expecting after Preacher's Daughter, and I think that starts on the 5th track, Onanist. Very fitting song title considering what this album's about. And this is the one song in the album that actually intrigued me a little bit more, as I do quite like the haunting piano melody and the way the vocals are layered on top of it, like venomous icing on a cake. It feels a lot less like drone music nor slowcore, and instead maybe more like chamber pop, and the dreaminess of it actually doesn't bother me here because it actually pairs it with haunting melodies and vocals. The problem is that there's so much static here where the higher frequencies really distract from the vibe and leave it having a lot less impact than I think it should. It is still my favorite song in the album though, and I'd be curious to hear her go further in this direction with her music. As it is, I only somewhat like it, but it's way more interesting than everything else here. Then we get track 6, Pulldrone, which is the longest track on the album, and that's definitely not a good thing considering how god-awful the production sounds to me, and that's a really bad sign considering there are so few instruments. It's basically just drone and vocals for the entire track, but it sounds so oddly staticky and the vocal effects don't convey any sort of emotion or feeling. It's literally like you're just sitting there watching paint dry for 15 minutes while someone outside is cutting grass and you close the window to get rid of the noise, but it's still there, but just a little bit of a foggier sound than it was before, and you find yourself even more annoyed. That happened to me at my last house all the time. It was really annoying. That's basically the equivalent to this track. And again, I can't help but feel like if this had been made by pretty much anybody else, the critics would probably be much more indifferent toward it. Following that, we get the track Etienne, which features some pianos that I think were intended to be way more haunting than they actually are, and instead of the extra noises and high frequencies adding any sort of spookiness or horror, it's just obnoxious instead. And then the acoustic guitar is added in to make this seem more layered than it actually is. And at the end of the day, I'm just left wondering why I needed to hear this, because it really doesn't feel interesting at all, outside of maybe the sampled story being told at the end, although even that doesn't really fit with such a dull instrumental song that leads into it. Seriously, this is a nearly 9-minute track that just keeps repeating the same thing over and over and over again, and it's not even a good melody, and it doesn't even have a good sound quality or vibe to it. Now, I will at least give the next track, The Torchia, a little bit of credit for at least evolving a little bit more throughout, even though I couldn't fully get into it. I'm just not really a big fan of the consistently rough timbre of the main drone going on throughout this song, and the non-lyrical vocals don't really do a whole lot for me. I was prepared to call this another complete slog of a track, but the more I listened to it, the more I realized there was at least a little more to it, with some good dynamics and a feeling like it's going somewhere interesting, even though I don't really think it ever does. And then we get the closing track, Amber Waves, which is a semi-return to the style of slowcore that she became popular for on Preacher's Daughter. And to me personally, that's not a good thing because it's so drowned in reverb to the point that any sort of emotional resonance this was aiming for just doesn't shine through for me as it feels so artificial and just really unpleasant. And it's another super long track as well. Now, before I finish up this review, yeah, I understand this project is in large part about the thematic arc, not just the way it sounds. And it's supposed to go together sonically to create a full album experience. Or EP experience, I guess. And the experimentation and avant-gardeness are completely the point, and this isn't intended to appeal to a mainstream audience. But 2 points I want to make. One being that if I don't like the style of music, then I don't like it. The other being that I don't really mind this style of music overall, it's just that this album doesn't really have a lot of impact for me. In fact, I'd be much more curious to hear more from Ethel Cain in this vein than whatever it was she attempted on Preacher's Daughter. This at least shows more potential in my opinion. But with all that being said, if there's an asterisk I'm going to put on this review, Look, I'm not religious, and I don't have nearly the same level of knowledge about the Bible and religious iconography that Hayden does. And while I did read all the lyrics to this, I feel like I have a lot of learning to do if I want to fully understand this project. But from looking at the lyrics, once again, the album in large part revolves around masturbation and also a feeling of closeness to God, and potentially the struggle of maintaining both those things in one's life. And unfortunately, it just doesn't feel super interesting to me, or at least it doesn't really resonate with me as a non-religious person, and it kind of feels like the themes are just going in circles without actually saying much of anything beyond what I've already explained here. But that's the interpretation from me, who has very little knowledge on the things Ethel Cain is writing about here, so I very well may be missing something that makes this more nuanced, but I still don't think this album is very good, or at the very least, I don't like it, and I honestly found it to be a chore to get through, just like I did with Preacher's Daughter. Now, I do think I like this a little bit more than that album. Just like that album, I'm giving this a 4 out of 10, but this time a much stronger 4 out of 10. Maybe partially because it commits more to a particular style that doesn't really work for me, rather than trying a bunch of styles and, in my opinion, failing at pretty much all of them. But I also think this is an improvement in that I don't think the production issues are quite as prevalent or extreme, and again, I think the track Onanist at least shows a bit more potential. But yeah, this review isn't going to make me popular. I know there have been lots of super positive reviews for this album, and just like with Preacher's Daughter, I'm not really sure I get the appeal. But I am happy for her that she has such a large fan base and has been getting so much acclaim. And also, if you're a fan of this album, I'm not trying to take that away from you. As always, it's all subjective at the end of the day. When I say whether I think it's good or bad, it's not like I can speak on it objectively, but I'm just telling you my opinion. I honestly just have a really hard time understanding what the big deal is with her music and why everyone's been saying this is like one of the best artists right now. I don't really get it. I didn't get it with Preacher's Daughter. I don't really get it with this. Again, I think it's a slight step in the right direction for me, but I couldn't get into it. It's too much for me to take in, especially considering how long it is, how long some of these tracks are. Again, songs like Pulldrone and Housofpsychoticwomn, they just go on for so long and just feel like there's nothing really going on, and at points it can actually get quite annoying. So yeah, this was not for me, but as always, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. I'm curious to hear some of the arguments in favor of this album. I have seen some reviews for it, and some of the things I've heard people say, I've sort of understood a little bit. There are definitely some moments where I think there were ideas where it could have worked more. Like her first album, I just felt like didn't do much of anything that I really found at all interesting, whereas here I feel like there's a bit more. It doesn't feel as tedious, but that's not saying much considering just how little I could get into Preacher's Daughter. But anyway, I think I'm kind of rambling now. I am working on more videos. I have a mini review video that should be coming out fairly soon, hopefully, and also I will review that Weekend album in an individual review hopefully soon. I've already started working on it. I'm hoping to get a little bit back on schedule. I got sick recently and I just completely lost motivation to work on videos for a little bit, and then I had some technical difficulties again with recording and finding a way to fit all the videos on my computer. But with all that being said, I'll be back soon with more reviews. Thank you for watching. If you hate me for this review, that's fine. You don't have to like my review. I don't have to like the album. But again, it's all just my opinion. Thanks for watching. I will see you all soon.